those who are the sort of primary stakeholders in the deal, but as well as for residents overall. But before I do that, let me just sort of give a quick coda on sort of the way California sort of organizes its redevelopment program, because it's sort of important in understanding the peculiar way in which San Diego implements its program. It's different from the way other big cities in California and elsewhere do redevelopment. So as probably many of you know, when a redevelopment area is created, the property taxes that flow to local agencies who depend on the property tax in those areas is frozen, sort of like the blue box in the graphic you see there. And after a redevelopment area is created, local governments continue to get the same amount of money and use it to fund the services that they're already providing. Now, any growth in the property tax revenue over time, rather than flow to these agencies or to Sacramento to be redistributed, stays with the redevelopment agency and is sort of used in the district to fund mostly new projects. Now, there are some sort of limits on how redevelopment funds are used. The state sort of changed the formulas by which the property tax is sort of allocated, even within these redevelopment areas over time. So for example, now something on average of 22% of it is passed through to local agencies. And so local agencies do get a small piece at least of this growing tax increment, but a lot of it stays inside to fund new projects. Around 20% of it, by law, is supposed to be spent for affordable housing. What you can't do with these tax increment funds is pay for sort of increasing level of services. So you might be able to build a fire station, but you can't pay for the firefighters who actually work there. Now, redevelopment has exploded since the late 1970s. It was actually invented in California in the 1950s as a way to help cities pay for their matching share of federal urban renewal grants. But with the passage of Prop 13, which made it very difficult for local governments to raise revenues in more traditional ways, such as through passing a property tax or a sales tax increase, redevelopment becomes a way for local governments to raise a lot of money and spend it very quickly, because you don't have to raise the money all at once. In fact, you can levy a bond, which is backed by the future revenues that supposedly will flow if redevelopment property tax increments grow over time. And so there's been a real explosion of redevelopment, especially in California since Prop 13. Now, sort of unnecessary to sort of reprise the redevelopment debate in California. It's pretty clear who won that debate. Nonetheless, redevelopment was controversial when it existed for a variety of reasons. Empirical studies that have been conducted suggest that, well, the economic impact overall of redevelopment is limited. It certainly is true that when you invest money in an area, the property values in that area increase relative to the areas that are not being subsidized. But what economists have found, who've looked at this problem, is that mostly what redevelopment does is it kind of shifts the investment from one part of the area in a metropolitan area and concentrates it inside these redevelopment areas where development is being subsidized. Now, the big reason that redevelopment was controversial is because it diverts revenues from other local agencies and it increases the cost that the state has to pay to fund public education. And that problem, this sort of tension between levels of government in the state, has increased as local governments have made increasing use of redevelopment as a local economic development program. So, for example, in 1978, redevelopment agencies received 2% of the property tax. By 2008, this had grown to roughly 12%, around $5.7 billion. And as I mentioned, local governments have sort of recognized the potential value of redevelopment areas and have been putting more and more of their taxable property inside these redevelopment areas where the property taxes are subject to this diversion. So, for example, in San Diego, around 40% of the property tax is subject to this redevelopment diversion program. And finally, critics of the redevelopment program have pointed to the limited transparency that the program was conducted under. There's no state agency that regularly reviews the activities of redevelopment agencies, and there's no process that checks how and when a redevelopment area is formed. When you form a redevelopment area, that obviously has impacts in terms of revenues that other local governments receive, but there really wasn't a process where policymakers would sit down and decide whether or not the benefits of forming a new redevelopment agency outweigh the costs. So with absent state oversight, really local governments are responsible for implementing the program and making sure that it satisfies both local priorities in terms of economic development, but the sort of letter and spirit of the redevelopment law itself. And mostly, in California at least, cities are responsible for this. In most cities, a city council forms the primary governing agency for the redevelopment agency. And redevelopment work is performed by civil city employees subject to local civil service contracting and other laws that most public agencies have to abide by. San Diego decided in the 1970s that it wanted to do redevelopment a little bit differently. And it did so by creating two nonprofit corporations, the most important of which was the Center City Development Corporation, which manages the city's redevelopment area downtown. And what's unique about these boards, or these agencies, is they're run by appointed boards, not the city council, not local elected officials, but appointed boards. And these agencies don't have to follow the same civil service contracting and hiring laws that govern other local public agencies. And in fact, this was one of the benefits that officials in San Diego thought that this nonprofit corporation approach would provide. And indeed, it's easy to see that, absent these what one of our interviewers called cumbersome local laws, you can take advantage of more flexibility and greater expertise, and this might benefit both residents and developers who are sort of involved in the redevelopment program. Now in the book, we argue that these, in practice, tend to operate like shadow governments. Not that they sort of operate nefariously at cross purposes with local government, but it's simply the fact that these appointed boards have different priorities, different senses of missions. They see themselves as serving different constituencies than the local elected officials who typically form the governing boards of redevelopment agencies elsewhere. And because they're quasi-public corporations, they're much harder for local residents and interested elected officials to sort of look inside and see how the decision-making process is happening in an ongoing way. So it was under this peculiar redevelopment regime that San Diego began and undertook its largest redevelopment program in its history. Our story sort of begins around the mid-1990s. The city had just refurbished its Mission Valley Stadium for the San Diego Chargers. The San Diego Padres, at the time, shared that stadium with the football team, but the San Diego Padres had a new owner, and the new owner was pressing the city to address what the team saw as the deficiencies in its current stadium deal. And so the mayor convened a task force, and in 1997, the task force came back with a set of recommendations. The first recommendation was a real boon to the Padres. It agreed that the team could survive in its current location and would have to have a new stadium. And the recommendation was to build this new stadium in downtown San Diego, as opposed to Mission Valley. Another recommendation is that the city should work with the team, and in exchange for investing money in this new stadium project, make the team sort of invest in some of the areas around the stadium, in the so-called East Village area. I don't know if you can see it here, which surrounds the ballpark. And so this made good financial and political sense. Financially, it was advantageous because by putting the ballpark downtown, the city was able to take advantage of these tax increment funds to close the gap between what its general fund could afford and what the team thought it needed to build a new modern baseball stadium. It was politically advantageous because you could sell the project as something more than just a giveaway to a wealthy baseball owner downtown, right? You could say, look, we're getting more than just a ballpark. We're getting help in redeveloping this area that's been more abundant downtown for some time. And so in 1998, the city worked with the Padres on a deal spelled out here that had obligations for the city. These were mostly fixed and upfront, around $215 million, mostly to be paid for with a revenue bond, a bond that would be paid for with new hotel revenues that the city anticipated it would realize as the Padres began to develop hotels and retail and other construction around the ballpark. The Padres were asked to put up around $115 million, and as an additional inducement, the city allowed the Padres to pay for its share with things like selling the naming rights of the stadium. So they got $60 million or something like that from Petco for the rights to name the stadium. Now, this was certainly a large delegation on the part of local elected officials. They were giving a private sector company, the Padres, a large amount of public resources, including land and money, and also land rights to determine what actually gets built around the ballpark. So this was a substantial delegation of authority. Now, when elected officials delegate, they try to protect themselves. one thing they try to do is they try to pick agents whose interests are going to be aligned with their own. And in this case, when you delegate to a private sector company as opposed to delegating to a public agency, that interest alignment is probably a little bit further apart than it would be if you chose some other kind of actor. And so that was potentially a problem. But another thing elected officials try to do when they delegate is introduce some amount of institutional controls. They try to protect themselves just in case the agents that they hire don't do what they're supposed to do. And so a lot of political science research, both theoretical and empirical, suggests that these relationships work when the controls are sufficiently strong, that is, they allow local officials to intervene in what their agents or partners are doing, and also when elected officials actually have incentives to use them. Now, we argue in Chapter 6 of the book that neither of these conditions was sufficiently met with the ballpark project, and you could probably broaden that to most of the relationships that the city's redevelopment agency has sort of undertaken in the past 10, 20 years. And as a result, after the deal gets signed in 1998, the deal begins to sort of stray from the objectives that voters originally signed off on in the 1998 election. Just to give you an example, the Padres were supposed to be providing some evidence that they were living up to their side of the bargain, and the city council was twice supposed to certify that the Padres were in fact doing this in 1999 and 2001. The problem was that by 2001, the Padres hadn't made very much progress on their end of the deal. They hadn't built very many of the hotels that the city was depending on to repay that stadium bond that it was using to build the stadium. Nonetheless, the city had already spent a lot of its money. It had cleared land for the ballpark downtown. In fact, construction had even begun. And if you canceled the deal, not only would you be canceling a project that voters found sort of very desirable, but you would be left with a big hole in downtown. And so without very much in the way of how you would sort of fix that problem. So this gave local elected officials very little incentive, in fact, to walk away from the deal. And this was probably anticipated even when the deal was signed, just to give you an example. I'm going to skip over this and talk a little bit about some of the sort of scorecard of this deal. Typically, when local officials in San Diego talk about development downtown and justify the large amount of expenditures that have gone there in the past 20 years, what they usually say is downtown is for everyone. Everyone benefits when downtown prospers. Well, it's certainly true that many people benefit when downtown prospers, and many people did get rich as a result of this redevelopment program. The owner of the Padres, for example, John Moore, saw the value of the team increase twofold. That is, the value of the Padres as a sort of commodity or a company more than doubled in a matter of 5 or 6 years. And certainly those who were interested in developing real estate downtown also stood to benefit, because once you put the ballpark and the convention center downtown, all of the properties in that area increased. And because these projects were located in the redevelopment zone, rather than the spillover in sort of the increasing property tax values being enjoyed by residents across the city, right, that increasing property tax increment stays in the redevelopment area. Was the ballpark fiscally neutral? It was sold to voters as something that wouldn't cost them any extra money, right? We don't have to raise taxes to pay for this. It turns out the ballpark is not fiscally neutral. In fact, if you add up all of the hotel construction, all of the new property tax revenue downtown, it's not enough money to cover the city's bond payments. And it's also not enough money to cover the annual operating costs of maintaining the stadium. And in fact, local officials recognized this a few years ago and asked the Center City Development Corporation to temporarily take over these obligations. But what about public benefits? Certainly, if you're a fan of the San Diego Padres, this seems like a great deal for you. The team has a brand new stadium. The team's fortunes haven't fared quite so well since then, but you know, it's a long-term process, right? So we'll see how that goes. One of the things that was really appealing to voters and elected officials when they first signed off on the deal is that they were promised a lot of new open space, a big, huge 4-acre park around the ballpark. And that was actually depicted in the renderings that voters saw. The Padres, using their authority to kind of fine-tune the ancillary development around the stadium, actually cut the size of that park to around 2 acres. And that's the only open space that's been created in downtown in the past 15, 20 years. As far as affordable housing, there's not very much of it. In fact, that's probably true of San Diego's entire redevelopment program. Since the 1970s, around 3,600 units of affordable housing have been built. Obviously, that's not enough units to keep pace with the growth of housing overall, so actually housing's become less affordable. And if you think about the sizable investment, it's not a very good return on investment if you think that redevelopment should primarily serve the housing needs of the community. So I'm going to close with a couple of sort of particular thoughts about San Diego, and then sort of suggest that you should buy our book because we think our book provides a sort of great insight into understanding urban politics in the 21st century and the kinds of governance crises we're likely to face. So first about San Diego. So who deserves the blame for this particular problem? In our book, we argue that it's actually voters who deserve a large share of the blame, although local elected officials are clearly culpable. So as Vladimir suggested, the pension fund has been used as a piggy bank in San Diego, not because anybody thinks it's a great idea, but because voters want higher levels of services. They reward politicians who promise this and provide it, but they're not very willing to raise taxes to support them. In fact, on several occasions, when they did have an opportunity to vote for revenue enhancements to help pay for the services residents were already enjoying, San Diego voters said no. Now, as Steve mentioned, there's a mayoral election this year, on June 5th. San Diegans will go to the polls to try to pick the next mayor to try to deal with this mess. Some of the candidates sort of are telling voters more of the same. We don't have to raise taxes to fix this problem. We don't have to cut services to fix this problem. What our analysis shows pretty clearly, I think, is that any candidate who says you can balance the budget without raising taxes or cutting services dramatically or both is flat out not being honest. Neither is probably the mayor of San Diego, who just, as Steve said, declared the budget to be balanced. But what our analysis suggests is that rather than sort of balance the budget in terms of revenues and expenditure needs, rather than taking from the pension, now instead we've taken from road maintenance. We've taken money that the city should be spending on infrastructure and maintaining its roads and used it to sort of balance the budget in the short term. So what about more broadly? Clearly, public pensions are not a peculiar province of San Diego. In fact, if you look across the country, state and local governments owe employees something on the order of $2.3 trillion in obligations. And if you look at the funding gap, the difference between what local governments have set aside and what they owe, the problem, the underfunding problem, is probably somewhere in the order of $300 to $700 billion. So that's a big problem. And San Diego is sort of an illustrative case that shows how difficult it is to close this gap. We also believe that most major metropolitan areas are sort of heading the way of San Diego on those three independent variables that Vladimir suggested earlier. Trust in government, for example. We know this falls in recessions. Today it's at historic lows, and that includes local governments. But voters haven't really adjusted their expectations about the level of services they want from government. So it's clear that public officials are hearing no new taxes and sort of are responsive to those demands for no new taxes, but they're also hearing demands from voters for greater levels of service. And so again, there's this sort of mismatch in the expectations about what voters have for services and the means that local governments have to pay for them. Steve and Vladimir talked about globalization. That's happening everywhere, and across the country, there's less and less participation by members of the business community, those who sort of staff and work in large corporations, to participate in local government. And what that also means is there's probably less monitoring of local governments and its officials. And because of things like the Voting Rights Act, which have increased the use of district elections across the country, the growing adoption of term limits, San Diego's institutional mix, its sort of unusual mix of sort of traditional machine-style institutions and progressive reform institutions is becoming even more common across the country. And as a result, it's going to make the problems that local governments face in dealing with these governance areas much more difficult to solve in the future. And sort of with that, I'll invite my two co-conspirators to come up, and we'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
You talked a little bit about the two constituencies issue with district elections for council members and at large for the mayor. We shouldn't talk about a remedy there. Are you suggesting that at-large elections for city council would be a significant component of how you solve these political problems?
So it's a great question, and let me start, and maybe Scott and Steve have something to add. And so the two constituency problem, we argue, it's important because of the city council and the mayor, but arguably a much larger problem is this combination of district elections to the city council, which passes the budget, but a citywide vote for raising taxes. And that two constituency problem is critical. And so certainly one solution is not having district elections, but the other solution is not requiring a citywide vote to increase taxes. And certainly, I think people can disagree about which of those solutions is more desirable, but having those two institutions in place really creates a recipe for gridlock and for spending levels that are not matched by the revenues needed to support them.
You know, and San Diego is an outlier because you have things like Proposition 13, which raised the bar to an extraordinary majority on those citywide tax votes. The other California big cities since 1995, 60% of tax increases have passed. They've got leadership that somehow convince voters, right, that it's in their self-interest to do so. In San Diego, zero. Since 1995, in the other California big cities, 75% of debt ballot measures, general obligation bonds have passed. In San Diego, zero. That's the whole thing about sort of controlling, right, for these state institutional rule changes. But there's something about the interaction between leaders and followers in San Diego. You don't get over the bar in the way that you do in most of the other California big cities. So it's the two constituency problem, but it seems to be magnified in this outlying case relative to others. Well, there's got to be more. Yes?
Could you talk about the dynamic with the San Diego County? Is there a similar situation in the county?
So I'll be happy to start this question.
And then we'll,
and I think it's, you know, we were on a panel talking about this book, and there was a county supervisor, and he said, you know, this book really highlights not only how screwed San Diego is, but how great the county of San Diego is, because we balance our budget, we have a massive surplus, we have this massive reserves, and I think it's very important in the California context to think about the key difference and the implications for politics between what cities do and what counties do. And so if you look at expenditure patterns, the biggest source of expenditures for both cities and counties is public safety. And in San Diego, the county government got out of the business of public safety on the fire side. So there's no county fire department, and there's almost no expenditures from the county budget to pay for fire protection. In the 70s, the county said, we don't have the money, we want fire protection in the outlying areas, create your own fire district and pay for it yourself. So there's less expenditure pressure that way, but also the second biggest category of expenditures when counties do is social services. And that's important because in the city of San Diego, the city provides public safety, it provides libraries, it provides recreation centers, and the typical voter wants more of those things. So politically, there's incentives to spend more. In the county of San Diego, one of your biggest categories of expenditures is social services, and the typical voter wants less of that. So politically, it's a lot easier to balance the budget than when all you have to do is really cut spending on things voters don't want, than to balance the budget in the city when the political pressure is to spend more to give voters more of the services they want. So San Diego County is in better shape, but I think it's partly because it simply does not provide fire protection like other counties do, and partly because, you know, politically it's very easy to balance the budget when all you have to do is really screw people on welfare and screw people getting food stamps, because politically that's very popular.
And San Diego County is an outlier in that it systematically underspends on health and welfare services for vulnerable populations compared to the other California big counties, which makes balancing the budget on the backs of these needy populations easier. Now, the ironic thing in terms of institutional changes, Brian, is that we finally have term limits coming to a supervisor near you in San Diego.
That'll fix it.
I have been a long-time opponent of term limits. Guess which way I voted on this measure?
Yes.
You have a county that has been trending from Republican to Democrat. You know, voted for Obama. This Board of Supervisors, 5 white Republicans. very interesting, which in a sense sort of exacerbates, right, the underspending in terms of those kind of needy constituencies. So look, the thing is, Stanford Press said, you know, the world of publications these days, it's not pages, it's not words, it's characters and spaces, which means there's a fungibility with endnotes. It all counts the same. But they kept, because production costs were rising, they kept saying, we want less, not more. So we cut like 1/3 out of the history chapter. I'm an historian as well as a political scientist, and I'm from LA. I wanted to tell that sort of civic DNA story and the role that competition with LA played. That went, but we had to make a decision in the regional chapter, what were we going to focus on? And we decided to keep the county out of it, except to tell the fire unprotection story. And it's a great story, and also exacerbated by institutional rules like Prop 13 in terms of districts and revenue streams that were created, little fire districts before Prop 13 relative to afterwards. So we focused in the regional and binational chapter on San Diego's penchant. Again, the place loves its peculiar institutions like this Downtown Redevelopment Agency, CCDC. San Diego resorts to regional special districts for things like water provision, the County Water Authority. I am public enemy number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 with the Water Authority these days because I'm somehow on the payroll of the arch enemy up in Los Angeles, the Metropolitan Water District. A regional airport authority created by esteemed, and I'm using the term ironically, former Senator Steve Peace, that was designed to make sure that there was no airport in San Diego besides Lindbergh Field, to basically say niet, no on Miramar as an alternative. We look at the Port District, these sort of single or limited purpose regional agencies and how they behave. And of course we also, because it is a binational region, we have to look at things like the 9/11 security, national security regime post 9/11 and what that does in terms of creating what is called, or was called in the minds of boosters, San Tijuana, you know, the border metropolis. But the county, and I've already threatened to a couple of the county supervisors by saying, well, we kept the county out of this story, so maybe that's the next book. But it's going to be on water.
Have you been invited to address the Sacramento City Council while you're here in town?
The phone has not been ringing, or email, or even texting, no.
We are happy to come back though.
Now look, we are into the second printing. Stanford loves us, we're golden. 1,000 copies the first year basically pays our little piddly advance royalties, and they're in the black. We, in 4 months, went through the 1,900 copies of the first printing. It's flying off the shelves in San Diego. The mayor hates us. I have been singled out personally as a critic. We actually believe that we are a primary reason that he balanced the budget while it was still on his watch. So we just did it right with another new piggy bank rather than the old one. We use the word failure in terms of governance throughout. The mayor's he's termed out, State of the City address, he used the word governance success 21 times. That was a new land speed record in San Diego. I think we got to it.
What lessons or learned or advice do you have for Sacramento, particularly in light of the King's downtown?
I'll give this to the guys. Woo!
It's a great question, and I think one of the major lessons in San Diego is that the pension issue is really toxic, and it affects every other governance sphere, regardless of sort of where the problem came from, regardless of what you think the merits are of pensions and how you think the problem should be solved. So in San Diego, for the past decade, everything has been about pensions, and almost every policy proposal has been argued based on its impact or its potential to solve the pension problem.
Right.
So in San Diego, there was a sales tax increase that was on the ballot in 2010. And it was clear that, you know, as we point out, you either increase taxes or you cut services. And public officials tried to make this clear. They came and said, if you don't vote for this tax increase, we're going to lay off cops, we're going to shut down your fire station, and service levels are going to be cut further. And yet you had a very small local constituency, people like Carl DeMaio, that said this is not a tax to pay for services, this is a pension tax. Which is technically true because over the next couple of years, the part of the budget that was growing was the pensions. And so if you were thinking about the marginal increase in the budget and the marginal increase in the revenue, you could make the argument that the revenue would go into the pension. But that became a very, very powerful argument against passing this tax increase, and in fact, it went down to defeat by resounding. I think it was a 30-70 vote. And so San Diego, you know, the pension problem has really become an argument against almost any sort of other policy, whether it's spending, whether it's tax increases. And it's going to be a very powerful argument until it's fixed, and as we point out, it's very hard to fix the pension problem. Because it's really not about the benefit levels, and it's not so much about the revenues, but it's about sort of a variety of policy decisions that took decades to build, and it's very hard to, in the course of a year or two, to make this decade-long problem suddenly go away without very, very hard sacrifices by a lot of people. And so until you fix the pension problem, I think it's going to be very hard to get anything done in the city of San Diego. And I think that's going to be true in California as well. You know, certainly it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the statewide tax and to what extent the pension issue and the public sector compensation issue is really going to be used as a hammer to argue that don't increase taxes because it's really just going to pay for those Cadillac pensions and salaries for these greedy public employees and UC presidents and CSU presidents.
The experience of the transit district in San Diego, does it run parallel to this story or does it run counter to this story?
You mean the Metropolitan Development Transit Agency and the North County? We've got
The trolley?
Trolley, and they also run buses.
Either one or both?
I have not. Actually, they're probably more success stories, though the thing is the trolley, you talk to Senator Jim Mills, it really is the Mills trolley, not the Pete Wilson trolley, in terms of who got the thing going way back when. You talk to Jim Mills, and you talk to Alan Hoffman, right, some of the top sort of transportation planners. And the thing is, all of the low-hanging fruit in terms of the cost-benefit ratio, in terms of ridership relative to cost, that's all gone. All of the new lines, right, basically the cost part of the equation increases, the benefit in terms of ridership and revenue is going down. So in a sense, what looks to be a success story to date, if they implement their plans, because they've got money from Transnet and other places, right, the sales tax increase that goes out to 2030, or 2050. But if you look further out, right, they too may be going the way of the other agencies.
So I guess that's what my question would get at then, because I didn't know where they stood on the sales tax, the equivalent of LA County's Prop A. But if they've had a sales tax increase there, and the city's failed, as you've indicated so dramatically, for both any tax increases and bond, is there any explanatory traction that you get from their experience of leadership and tax increases and that compared to the redevelopment and the pension?
Rich, it's a thing called Transnet, which was this a sales tax increase to fund transit broadly defined, highways as well as public transportation, got over the 60s, the 2/3 bar. Now, what is different about that for the county, for the region, relative to the experience of the city where it's no, 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 no on tax increases? Well, the first thing is that they put the proposal up early. They thought they would have 2 more election cycles should voters say no. And the first time around, basically what they did was there was something for everyone. For the developers in North County, there was a lot of money for roads and highways, right, to new subdivisions, etc. There was money for the public transit people, the enviros. So You know, the way that it was split was designed, in a sense, right, to create an umbrella, a larger coalition and constituency. And even though there was some division among the supervisors, right, they spoke with a more unified voice than we frequently see in the city in terms of elected officials on tax increases, and the media supported it. You know, I mean, I come from LA. They had a fire tax back in the late 1990s that essentially pays for the county fire department that got over the 2/3 vote. Everybody was on board. Labor, the supervisors, the business community, the media. Everybody spoke with one voice because that bar is not easy to get over. Transnet, it worked. But the thing is, what then happened was the battle between the different sort of priorities and missions, public transit versus highways, that battle intensified because what you really give the voters is sort of a projection or a guideline. But there's a lot of gray.
Deliberate ambiguity.
Deliberate ambiguity to create the minimum winning coalition, as we learned in all those poli-sci classes. But now the real fun, and the enviros are suing, etc., in terms of how that money will be allocated going forward. But that too, you know, is a very interesting story. But you see, that's a regional story, and this is a book really about a city, much less than a region. So another reason to have a sequel. Yes. Maybe a sequel to the sequel to deal with these other issues. Good question. God, it's great to see new faces. Old, yes, please.
If nobody else has a question, I have a second question.
Well, or a third or a fourth.
And
Go right ahead.
maybe it doesn't fit with your research, but can you elaborate on the difference between San Diego Health and Human Services relative to other counties?
You know, I think we can speak very generally. There was a great study that was done by the Rose Institute at Claremont, which